Hello, greetings participants of conference in Plovdiv, Bulgaria. My name is Gerti SQAPİ and here I'm making my video presentation for my conference paper in this conference. My conference paper is entitled Self-Expression Values as a Conditional Factor for the Establishment of Well-Functioning Democracy, and I take the Albania as a case for my study in my paper. My article aims to highlight the self-expression values emphasized among the masses of society as an influential factor for the establishment of a well-functioning democracy. The development of self-expression values emphasized among the members of society as an independent variable in my study, I argue that has a significant impact on the functioning of democratic institutions, since these values, the self-expression ones, are essentially for all the civil and political freedoms that constitute a democratic system. A civic culture emphasized by the majority of citizens through self-expression values is the main force that motivates and shapes collective action in favor of a desired end. In our case, it's a well-functioning democracy, which is the dependent variable of the study, as well as it narrows the opportunities of the political elites of a particular country to behave in authoritarian ways or in ways that contradict the democratic principles. The central claim of the culturalist authors for the explanation of the democratization processes was that political institutions and the cultural values of the masses in that country must be in harmony with each other in order to produce stable and effective democratic regimes. This claim is made by authors like Almond, Verba, Eckstein, etc. The culturalist accounts must be understood within the modernist paradigm for the explanation of the democratizing processes, since among the main assumptions of the modernist paradigm is that democracy in a country thrives as a result of its functional adaptation to some prerequisites that are considered essential, in this case with the civic political culture. The emphasis of culturalist authors within the modernist paradigm is on the overall impact of the modernization processes on a country's regime through its tendency to give life to cultural change that place an increasing emphasis on human emancipation and on self-expression values. Engelhardt and Welzel, two authors to which I refer in my study, offer a revised version of modernization theory by emphasizing the civic self-expression values as a prerequisite for democracy. And they argue the major effect of modernization is not that it makes democracy more acceptable to elites, but that it increases ordinary people's capabilities and willingness to struggle for democratic institutions. The two authors claim that the change in the values of the masses of a society has a causal impact on democracy, which they try to explain through the impact that modernization has on transformation of emancipation values of the citizen of a country, and how the adoption of these values afterward create the suitable environment that push the demands for democracy. So, in line with the culturalist explanation, it is argued that the development of civic values among the masses of citizens, which are in harmony with the institutional structure of democracy, also enables the effective functioning of these institutions. This is the hypothesis of my study. The development of the values of self-expressions are the ones that have the main impact on the functioning of democratic institutions of a country, since these values are essentially crucial for all civil and political freedoms that embody a democratic system. Democracy is the system that institutionalizes the civil and political liberties of citizens, and the demand for democracy reflects precisely the priority that people give to freedom and autonomous choice. Democratic institutions represent an institutional supply of freedom because democracy institutionalizes civil and political liberties, and self-expression values create a cultural demand for freedom because these values emphasize freedom of choice. A civic culture that is emphasized by the vast part of the masses through self-expression values is also the main force that motivates and shapes collective action in favor of a certain product. The adoption of democracy and its well-functioning in countries where it's established. As Engelhardt and Welzel puts it, there are two main ways in which emancipatory social forces consisting of self-expression values can promote and challenge elite behavior in favor of democracy. The first possibility derives from the properties of society in which self-expression values are widespread. By definition, such a society contains a large proportion of people who value human emancipation and who are inclined to actively protest against unacceptable elite action. In a society with widespread self-expression values, peoples are likely to join mass social movements and support public campaigns that put pressure on elites to respond to their demands and respect their rights. From here, it can be understood that the main effect of the self-expression values, widely spread among the masses of citizens, is through the effective pressure they can generate on the elites, making them more responsible and thus also ensuring their accountability. Broad movements of social forces, diverse campaigns or protests can generate such pressures from ordinary people. They can ensure the responsiveness of politicians in the face of citizens' demand or their withdrawal from unacceptable decisions that conflict with the public good. Self-expression values also contribute to the efficient operation of democracy by counteracting the undemocratic tendencies. This is because the growing emphasis of these values affects not only the general populace but also the politicians and the elite of a given nation. Such a view suggests that self-expression values emerge among the mass publics. They also tend to emerge among the elites of the society. This means that if a society's mass culture becomes more hostile to favoritism, corruption, and authoritarianism, elite culture is likely to do as well like this. Surely it can be said that the political elites are the ones mainly responsible for the creation, for the craft and functioning of democratic institutions in a country. By definition, this one. However, the decisions and actions of political elites can only be understood in the context of the social forces that influence and condition the behavior of these elites. In this sense, the emancipatory social forces consisting of an increasing emphasis on self-expression values among the masses of the population create increasing pressure for the elites to ensure their integrity and adherence to the rules of democratic game, and ultimately also guarantee the effective functioning of democratic institutions. The more solid and the more widespread are the self-expression values among the masses of a country's population, the more likely it is that the violations and infringements of democratic norms by incumbents will not be tolerated, and thus it is ensured that democratic institutions function effectively. If we were to take it from the opposite perspective of the existence of civic political culture, a society where the majority of its members emphasize survival values over self-expression values, there would be very little or no pressure at all to push back against the elite behavior in favor of efficient operation of democratic institutions in that particular settings. Again, as Engelhardt and Christian Wells have explained, weak self-expression values imply strong survival values, which drive people to seek protection in closely knit groups and to create strong bonding ties, cultivating favoritism for insurance against the risk of life. Favoritism provides a fertile ground for corruption. Corruption comes to be the standard behavior that people expect from elites in a survival culture, as opposed to self-expression values. In such a setting, public pressure on incumbents to maintain accountability and adherence to democratic standards would be very minimal, substantially impeding the operation of democratic institutions. This is because the general public's values, which prioritize survival over self-expression values, would be biased toward pursuing narrow and particularistic personal interest at the expense of common good, or guaranteeing the respecting of freedoms and rights of citizens at all costs. A society where a large proportion of populace emphasize such a culture would not only not alter the inclination of political elite in charge of the institution, but it would also be reflected in the way these elites lead, depending on similar forms of corruption and favoritism to win over the electorate and maintain their position of power. In the culture of a society that emphasizes survival values, this behavior on the part of political elite will be considered acceptable, despite the fact that it would conflict inherently with the norms of democratic function of institutions, and would make it more difficult, or not to say impossible, effective institutionalism and the consolidation of democracy in that setting. Regarding self-expression values, they are a syndrome. I'm going to define their self. What I mean by what Engelhardt and Welzel mean by self-expression values. They are a syndrome of the attitude of the masses that constitute a single fundamental variable. They are present in the political culture of a country as long as their public or masses of their citizens emphasize freedom and participation, public self-expression, tolerance of diversity, interpersonal trust, and life satisfaction. These are the components of self-expression values that are taken in here as integrated with each other because they constitute a coherent, stable, but not immutable syndrome and a single dimension of attitude that characterizes political culture to varying degrees, and which in different societies is manifested at high levels and in some other societies at lower levels. Here it is argued that the more the values of self-expression are emphasized and reflected among the members of society as opposed to the survival values, the more likely their conditioning effect on democracy and its well-functioning in settings is to be weighted. In the empirical presentation of self-expression values measured in different societies and their link to successful or problematic democratization, most of the societies, according to Engelhardt and Welzel, most of the societies under continued authoritarianism score between the 14 and 25 percentile in self-expression values, whereas the most societies with complete democratization or with well-functioning democratization score between 29 and 38 percentile of self-expression values reflected among the masses of their citizens. Regarding Albania, which I take as a case study and which I refer on my empirical presentation here, Albania continues to have a democratic political system that have serious flaws. Since the norms and fundamental values of the system of democratic system in Albania are continually disregarded. An effective democracy has not yet resulted in Albania's regime transition 32 years after the communist government communist system was overthrown. The low levels of self-expression values compared to the high levels of survival and materialistic ones reflected among the members of Albanian society have been and remained an influential conditional factor for the failure to achieve successful democratization in Albania. The self-expression values reflected and measured for Albanian society during the 90s are reflected in very low levels, embraced by only 18-19% of its general populations. Such levels of self-expression values in Albanian society remain low to condition the well-functioning of the institutional norms of democracy, often making them also ineffective. Also, the studies carried by scholars like Kozani on the value profile of post-communist Albania conclude that Albanian society belongs to the system of value of materialistic profile. Conversely, the post-materialist principles like democracy, equality, justice, and dedication to public causes, considered above as a syndrome of attitude of the masses tapped by self-expression values, are far from prevailing in today's Albanian society. It should also be emphasized that different conditions of historical development, those of social structure and economic development during the start of transition during the 90s in Albania, have not been very suitable to give life to changes of these cultural components, the self-expression values, that are highlighted here. The societies of the Eastern Europe bloc, under the orbit of influence of Soviet Union, had taken shape during almost 5 decades of their communist period, with a totally socialist economy and regime that had shaped almost every aspect of private life of its citizens subjects. In Albania, such a totalitarian regime had lasted among 47 years, from 1944 to 1991, with its model of almost universal penetration in state-society relations. It had led considerable negative consequences in the shaping of Albanian society and its values. Such a communist legacy has left significant social restrictions on autonomous human choice in Albanian society, which also reflect the tendency of its member to emphasize survival materialist values foremost versus those of self-expression that are conducive to democracy. Likewise, the conditions of economic development in Albania during and after the start of the transition were not at such high levels as to be translated into the well-being of the citizens and to give life to the rising emancipation of human values among them, and to reduce the social restriction on their choice and autonomy. Thus, the Albanians, based mainly on the materialistic profile of the values that dominate also in today's society, continue to favor private benefits and particularist interests to the detriment of common good or the universalistic rules established in the laws. In Albania, there is very little respect for the rule of law and its implementation on the part of political elite. The attitudes prevalent among members of Albanian society and among the political elite itself alike is that the law is something negotiable, and therefore it is not obligatory for one to follow certain rules or laws. In such an environment, where mass culture is more closely associated with favoritism, corruption, and the dominance of personal and particularistic interests, that is, with freedom, public self-expression, interpersonal trust, and other civic virtues, the social pressure from below to ensure the integrity and behavior of the elites in line with the rules and norms of democratic game would be less. Political accountability among the ranks of Albanian politicians remain at very low levels. The authoritarian or corrupt behavior of political elites in Albania in most cases has not constituted scandals and often has passed away with any political cost. The rule of law also, as one of the vital dimensions of democracy in Albania throughout this period, has functioned with significant deficits, with its citizens being passive and unable to unite and exert pressure on the political elite to adhere to its principles and norms. In such a context, the gap between formal democratic institutions, which operate with problems in the case of Albania, as I argued before, and the well-functioning of an effective democracy is much more difficult to close in its political system, since the cost of the political elites to maintain their grip on power, despite the violations of the norms and the rule of democratic game, are not high in front of a mass culture that tolerate these transgressions and violation of democratic norms. As we have mentioned above, in terms of definition and functioning of modern liberal democracy, which I say a well-functioning democracy, the political elites are the main ones responsible by definition for the creation and functioning of democratic institutions. However, their decisions and action can only be understood in the context of social forces that influence and condition them. The weak level of self-expression values reflected in nowadays among members of Albanian citizens have not managed to generate emancipatory false social forces such as to condition or to influence the behavior of political elites in favor of democracy and its effective functioning in Albanian political settings. In the absence of such social force that place primary emphasis on human emancipation and self-expression values, joint collective action and the necessary pressure that would condition the behavior of elites in favor of achieving the democratic outcome and make it more effective seem to be very difficult to be achieved in Albania. Similarly, liberal democracy is unlikely to be consolidated or to operate effectively if it exists in a culture dominated by survival values which subordinate human freedom to social comfort and state authority. Such conclusions seem to stand in the case of democratization in Albania that was analyzed here. The low levels of self-expression values, which include opposing high levels of survival values reflected among the Albanian populace in general, have not led at all to the outcome of democratic consolidation in Albania, still 32 years after the communist dictatorship was overthrown in 1991 in Albania. As I'm going to cite for one last time Engelhardt and Welzel, which have evidence that it is no coincidence that transitions that have stopped or have been reversed in precisely those countries with the weakest self-expression values reflected among masses in their society. The case of Albanian society constitutes one such example, where the values of self-expression are reflected in very weak levels or relatively weak levels among the masses of citizens, and where the democratization has turned out to be unsuccessful and still operate with serious deficits in today in Albania. Here it was my presentation. I hope success to all participants to this conference in Plovdiv. Wish you luck and goodbye.